The sun beat down mercilessly as Bethany Keller watched the dust cloud disappear over the horizon, taking with it her last hope of reaching California. At 22, she had never felt so utterly alone. Her ankle throbbed where she'd twisted it the previous day, and now the Wallace Creek wagon train her passage to a new life was gone, continuing west without her. It was 1853, and the promise of gold and fertile land had drawn hundreds of families westward, including her own. But now her family was dead, buried in shallow graves along the Oregon Trail after cholera swept through their group. She had continued on, attaching herself to the Wallace Creek train, working as a helper to Mrs. Thornton, the wife of the wagon master. But yesterday's accident had left her behind at their temporary camp when she couldn't walk fast enough to keep up. "We can't wait," Mr. Thornton had said grimly. "Indians spotted to the north. We must make the pass before the weather turns." He'd left her a canteen, some jerky, and a small pistol with 6 bullets. Then they were gone, promising to send help if they could, words Bethany knew were empty as soon as they were spoken. Now she sat beneath the lone cottonwood tree that marked their camping spot, somewhere in the Idaho territory, miles from anything resembling civilization. The creek nearby provided water, but she had no way to hunt, and her supplies would last 3 days at most. She closed her eyes against the heat and harsh reality of her situation. No family, no friends, no future. Just the vast emptiness of the frontier and the growing certainty that she would die here, alone and forgotten. Bethany didn't know how long she'd dozed when the sound of hoofbeats jolted her awake. Her hand flew to the pistol at her side as she squinted into the afternoon sun. A lone rider approached, kicking up dust, his broad-shouldered silhouette growing larger as he neared. Her heart hammered. One rider could mean many things in this wilderness, most of them dangerous for a woman alone. The horseman slowed his mount, a magnificent chestnut stallion that snorted and pawed the ground. The man's face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was young, perhaps 25, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "Miss Keller." His voice carried across the distance between them, deep and tinged with concern. Bethany's breath caught. "Who are you?" He dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse closer before removing his hat. The sun caught in his sandy brown hair as intense hazel eyes studied her. "Kieran Kane. I ride scout for the Wallace Creek train sometimes. I was tracking a hunting party when I noticed they'd moved on without you." "They left yesterday morning," she said, her voice small and bitter. Kieran nodded, his expression grim. Thornton's always been more concerned with schedules than people. He crouched beside her, his gaze falling to her swollen ankle. "May I?" After her hesitant nod, he gently examined her injury, his calloused hand surprisingly tender. "Not broken, just a bad sprain, but you won't be walking on it any time soon. I know. That's why they left me." The words caught in her throat. Something flashed in his eyes, anger perhaps. "I've ridden 3 days tracking them, then backtracking to find you." He stood, scanning the horizon. "Night's coming soon. We should make camp properly." He hesitated. "I'll get you to safety, Miss Keller. You have my word." For the first time since the wagon train disappeared, hope flickered in Bethany's chest. "Why would you come back for me? You don't even know me." Kieran Kane smiled then, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "No decent man leaves a person to die in the wilderness, madam. Especially not someone as determined as you must be to have made it this far." As the sunset painted the Idaho sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Bethany watched Kieran efficiently set up a small camp. Perhaps she wasn't as forgotten as she'd thought. The night settled around them as Kieran built a small fire. His movements were precise and economical, marking him as someone accustomed to survival in harsh conditions. Bethany sat with her back against her makeshift pack, her injured ankle stretched before her. The pain had dulled to a persistent throb, but it was the uncertainty of her future that troubled her more. "You hungry?" Kieran asked, breaking the silence that had grown between them. Bethany nodded, suddenly aware of the emptiness in her stomach. "I've been rationing what little they left me." His jaw tightened momentarily before he reached into his saddlebag. "I've got some dried buffalo meat and cornbread. Not much, but better than jerky." He handed her a substantial portion, more than she expected. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting the food. "You're very kind to share." "It's not kindness, Miss Keller, just common decency." He settled across the fire from her, his features illuminated by the dancing flames. "If you don't mind me asking, where's your family?" The question, though expected, still pierced her. "Dead. Cholera took my parents and younger brother near Fort Laramie. I was the only one who survived." She stared into the fire, the memories washing over her. "The Thorntons took me on as help. I did laundry, cooking, whatever was needed." "I'm sorry about your family," he said, genuine sympathy in his voice. "Losing folks on the trail, it happens too often." "What about your family, Mr. Kane?" she asked, eager to shift the focus away from her grief. A shadow passed over his face. "Call me Kieran, please." "My father was a trapper who married a Shoshone woman, my mother. They both died when our cabin caught fire. I was 15. He took a bite of his cornbread, chewing thoughtfully. "Been on my own since, working as a scout, sometimes a hired gun when necessary, though I don't much care for that work." Bethany studied him in the firelight. His clothing was worn but clean buckskin pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. A revolver hung at his hip, and she'd noticed a rifle in his saddle holster. He wore his hair longer than most white men, tied back with a thin leather cord. The mixed heritage was visible in his features, the high cheekbones and straight nose, the intensity of his gaze. "Where will you take me?" she finally asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind. "There's a settlement about 4 days' ride from here, Wallace, Idaho. Small but growing. They've got a doctor who can tend to your ankle properly." He paused. "From there, you could catch another wagon train west later in the season, or—" He left the alternative unspoken. "Or stay," she finished for him. The idea of stopping, of not continuing the journey that had already cost her so much, felt strange. California had been the dream, her parents' dream. Without them, did it matter where she ended up? "It's a decent place," Kieran continued. "I've got a small cabin outside town. Use it when I'm not on the trail. You're welcome to stay there until you figure things out." The offer surprised her. "You'd trust a stranger in your home?" A slight smile touched his lips. "You don't strike me as the type to burn a man's cabin down, Miss Keller." Despite everything, she found herself returning his smile. "Please call me Bethany, and no, arson isn't among my vices." "What are your vices, then?" he asked, the question lighter than their previous conversation. She considered this. "Stubbornness. A tendency to speak my mind when proper ladies should remain silent. An unfortunate habit of reading books when I should be doing needlework." His smile widened. Terrible qualities, indeed. For the first time in months, Bethany felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire before her. "What about you? What vices should I know about if I'm to stay in your cabin? Besides rescuing stubborn, book-reading women," he quipped. "I've been known to track game for days rather than return to civilization. Some might call me a loner." His expression grew more serious. "And I don't always fit in either world, too Indian for some white folks, too white for the tribes. Makes for an interesting life, but not always an easy one." The honesty in his admission touched her. "I imagine that would be difficult." "It has its moments," he acknowledged. But it's given me perspective, taught me to judge people by their actions, not where they come from. Bethany nodded, understanding more clearly why he might have ridden back for a woman abandoned by her traveling companions. Well, I'm grateful for your perspective, Kieran Kane, and for your rescue. Don't thank me yet, he warned, though his tone remained light. We've still got a journey ahead of us, and you'll have to put up with my company for days. I think I can manage that burden, she replied, surprising herself with the teasing note in her voice. As the night deepened around them, they fell into easier conversation. Kieran told her about the territories he'd scouted, the beauty of landscapes few white people had ever seen. Bethany shared stories of her life in Missouri before the journey west, her father's small farm, her mother's garden, the books she'd treasured and been forced to leave behind. When exhaustion finally overcame her, Kieran insisted she take his bedroll while he kept watch. As she drifted to sleep beneath the star-scattered sky, Bethany felt, for the first time since losing her family, that she might not be alone after all. Morning brought a crystalline sky and the scent of coffee brewing over a small fire. Bethany opened her eyes to find Kieran already awake, tending to his horse and preparing for their departure. She attempted to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her ankle. "Easy," he cautioned, moving to her side. "Let me help you." His strong hand supported her as she maneuvered into a sitting position. The proximity was startling. She could smell the leather of his vest, the faint pine scent that clung to him. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Her brown hair had partially escaped its braid, and her dress was wrinkled and dust-stained. If Kieran noticed her appearance, he gave no indication. "Coffee," he offered, pouring the steaming liquid into a tin cup. "It's strong enough to wake the dead, but it'll keep you warm." She accepted gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "What's our plan for today? We'll head northwest toward Wallace. The terrain's rough in places, but Eclipse is sure-footed." He nodded toward his chestnut stallion. "You'll ride, I'll walk alongside." "Both of us could ride," she suggested. "I'm not heavy." He shook his head. "Eclipse is a good horse, but he's been running hard these past days to find you. I won't tax him further if I don't have to. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "I'm used to covering ground on foot." After a breakfast of the remaining cornbread, Kieran carefully helped Bethany onto his horse. The pain in her ankle flared as he lifted her, drawing a sharp intake of breath that she couldn't suppress. "Sorry," he said, genuine concern in his eyes. "We'll take it slow, stop often to rest." Once she was settled in the saddle, Kieran gathered their meager supplies and secured them. With one last look around the abandoned campsite, he took Eclipse's reins, and they began their journey. The morning passed in relative silence as they established a rhythm. Kieran led the horse along what appeared to Bethany to be an invisible trail, occasionally pointing out landmarks or signs of wildlife. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Bethany's throat was parched despite their careful rationing of water. When they stopped in the shade of a rocky outcropping, Kieran helped her down from the saddle, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "How's the ankle?" he asked, easing her onto a flat boulder. "Throbbing," she admitted, "but I'll manage." He knelt to examine it, gently removing her boot and the bandage he'd applied the previous night. His touch was clinical, but Bethany couldn't help the flutter in her stomach at his proximity. "The swelling's no worse," he pronounced. "That's good. I'll rewrap it tighter to give you more support." From his pack, he produced fresh cloth strips that he'd somehow dampened. The cool fabric against her skin brought immediate relief. "Where did you learn to treat injuries?" she asked, watching his deft movements. "My mother taught me some. The rest came from necessity." He secured the bandage with practiced ease. When you travel alone, you either learn to tend your own wounds or you don't survive long. You've survived a long time then. He glanced up, meeting her eyes. Longer than some expected. There was a story there, Bethany sensed, but she didn't press. Instead, she gazed out at the landscape stretching before them, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the occasional stand of pines breaking the endless sea of prairie grass. "It's beautiful," she murmured, in a harsh way. Kieran followed her gaze. "The territory gets under your skin after a while, makes it hard to imagine living anywhere else. Is that why you stay, even with—" She hesitated, unsure how to delicately reference the prejudice he'd alluded to facing. "Even with not quite belonging," he finished for her. "Partly. And partly because out here, a man is judged more by his actions than his bloodline. In cities, people see what they expect to see. In the wilderness, they see what's actually there." Bethany considered this. "I've never thought of it that way. I've always lived around people, neighbors, church, community. And now," the question hung in the air between them. "Now I don't know where I belong," she confessed. "The plan was California, but that was my parents' dream more than mine. I just followed because they were my family." Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Family has a way of defining our paths until suddenly they don't." "Exactly." The simple acknowledgement of her situation was strangely comforting. "What would you do if you were me?" He seemed surprised by the question, taking a moment to consider as he recapped their water canteen. "I'd wait until my ankle healed, then decide. No sense making life-changing decisions when you're injured and grieving." His pragmatic answer made her smile. "Wise advice, Mr. Kane." "Not wisdom, just experience." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should keep moving. There's a creek about 2 hours ahead where we can refill our water and make camp for the night." As he lifted her back onto Eclipse, their eyes met briefly. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. Then the moment was gone, and they were moving again, Kieran's steady pace setting their rhythm across the vast Idaho landscape. The afternoon stretched on, the terrain gradually changing as they traveled northwest. The rolling grasslands gave way to more rugged country, with stands of pine growing thicker and small creeks cutting through the land. Kieran pointed out tracks in the soft earth near one such waterway, deer, coyote, and once, the massive paw print of a mountain lion. "Nothing to worry about," he assured Bethany when he saw her anxious glance. "They generally avoid humans, but it's why we keep the fire going at night." By the time they reached the promised creek, shadows had lengthened across the land, and Bethany's back ached from hours in the saddle. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones beneath a canopy of aspens that rustled in the evening breeze. Kieran helped her dismount and settle on a fallen log while he saw to Eclipse's needs first, removing the saddle and bridle and letting the tired horse drink his fill before leading him to a grassy patch to graze. "He's a beautiful animal," Bethany remarked as Kieran returned to set up their camp. "He was a gift," Kieran said, gathering wood for a fire. "From a Nez Perce horse trader whose daughter I helped when she fell ill with fever. Their horses are the finest in the territory. You've helped quite a few people, it seems." He shrugged, arranging stones in a circle. "No more than have helped me over the years." As darkness fell, Kieran built a small fire and produced from his saddlebag several potatoes and an onion. "Not much of a feast," he apologized, slicing them into a small pot with a handful of dried meat. "But better than nothing." "It smells wonderful," Bethany assured him truthfully. The simple stew bubbling over the fire was more appetizing than anything she'd eaten in weeks. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the gentle gurgling of the creek. The first stars appeared overhead, brilliant points of light in the darkening sky. "My father used to say each star was a soul watching over us," Bethany said softly, gazing upward. "I wonder if he's up there now, along with my mother and brother." Kieran followed her gaze. "My mother's people believe something similar, that our ancestors become part of the night sky, guiding us home when we're lost. That's a comforting thought." She smiled across the fire at him. "Maybe they guided you to find me." Something flickered in his eyes, but he merely nodded. "Maybe so." Later, as Bethany settled into the bedroll Kieran had again insisted she take, she found herself watching him as he sat beside the fire, whittling a small piece of wood with practiced movements of his knife. "What are you making?" she asked sleepily. He glanced up, seemingly surprised that she was still awake. "A whistle. Old habit, passes the time during night watches. You don't sleep much, do you? 4 hours is enough for me." His knife continued to shape the wood. "Years of scouting trains through dangerous territory teaches a man to sleep light and wake often." "It must be a lonely life," she observed, his hand stilled momentarily. "Sometimes, but there's a freedom in it too." Bethany considered this. "Freedom and loneliness seem to go hand in hand out here." "They don't have to," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. The implication in his words sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the flames between them. "No," she agreed softly. "I suppose they don't." She fell asleep watching his silhouette against the starry sky, his steady presence a comfort in the vast wilderness. Morning came with a light rain that pattered on the canvas Kieran had rigged above their camp. Bethany woke to find him already alert, watching the skies with a concerned expression. "Storm coming?" she asked, pushing herself up on her elbows. He nodded. "Weather's changing faster than I expected. We need to find better shelter than what I can rig here." He began efficiently packing their meager camp. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles from here. Not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof." The urgency in his movements told Bethany more than his words. Within minutes, she was back on Eclipse, Kieran leading them at a brisk pace through increasingly dense forest. The rain intensified, fat droplets finding their way through the pine boughs to soak their clothing. By the time the cabin came into view, a small, weathered structure nestled against a hillside. They were both drenched, and the sky had darkened to an ominous slate gray. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "Just in time," Kieran said, helping Bethany down from the saddle. She couldn't suppress a gasp as her weight landed on her injured ankle. "Lean on me," he instructed, wrapping an arm around her waist. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn furniture, a table, a chair, and a narrow bed frame with a straw-filled mattress occupied the single room. "Stay here," Kieran said, settling her on the chair. "I need to get Eclipse into the lean-to out back before the worst hits." Alone, Bethany looked around at her temporary shelter. Despite its rustic appearance, someone had taken care with its construction. The walls were chinked with clay to keep out drafts, and wooden shutters could be closed over the single window. A few crude shelves held dusty tins and jars, their contents long since spoiled or taken. Kieran returned minutes later, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Eclipse is settled," he reported, shrugging off his wet outer garments. "Now for a fire before we both catch our death." He moved efficiently, checking the chimney for blockages before arranging kindling and logs from a stack beside the hearth. Soon, a small flame flickered, gradually building to a cheerful blaze that filled the cabin with welcome warmth and light. "We should get you out of those wet clothes," he said, then immediately looked uncomfortable as he realized the implication of his words. "I mean, I have a spare shirt in my pack. It's dry. You could use it while your dress dries." Bethany felt a blush rise to her cheeks despite the chill in her bones. "Thank you. That would be helpful." He turned his back politely, busying himself with unpacking supplies while she struggled out of her sodden dress. The process was awkward with her injured ankle, but she managed to slip into his offered shirt a soft, faded blue flannel that hung to her knees. The masculine scent of it surrounded her, oddly comforting. "I'm decent," she finally said, wrapping a blanket he'd laid out around her shoulders for additional modesty. When Kieran turned, his eyes widened slightly before he quickly averted his gaze. "Good. That's good. I'll hang your dress near the fire to dry." The storm intensified outside, wind howling around the cabin's corners and rain drumming on the roof. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the room through the small window, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. "Quite a storm," Bethany observed, trying to ease the sudden tension between them. Kieran nodded, arranging her dress on a makeshift line near the fire. "Spring storms in these mountains can be fierce but usually pass quickly. We might be here overnight, though." The realization that they would be spending the night alone in such close quarters hung between them. Bethany found herself studying Kieran as he moved about the cabin, his movements efficient and controlled despite the confined space. The firelight caught the angles of his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes when they occasionally met hers. "Are you hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Yes, actually." From his pack, he produced a small pouch of coffee, another of dried meat, and to her surprise, a tin of peaches. "Where did you get those?" she asked, eyeing the luxury with astonishment. A smile tugged at his lips. "Traded for them at Fort Hall before I set out to find you." Thought they might be a welcome change from jerky and hardtack. The consideration behind the gesture touched her. "That was very thoughtful," he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. Seemed like the kind of thing that might bring a smile after a hard few days. And it did make her smile, widely and genuinely. "You were right." They shared the simple meal, listening to the storm rage outside. The peaches were sweet and juicy, a burst of summer flavor that seemed miraculous after weeks of bland trail food. Bethany couldn't remember the last time something so simple had brought her such pleasure. As they finished eating, Kieran checked her ankle again. His touch was gentle as he unwrapped the bandage to examine the swelling. "It's looking better," he pronounced, "but you'll need to stay off it as much as possible for a few more days." "Not much choice at the moment," she said, glancing toward the window where rain continued to lash against the glass. He rewrapped her ankle, his fingers warm against her skin. "Tomorrow should be clear enough to travel. Another 2 days to Wallace if the creeks haven't risen too much." "And then what?" The question slipped out before she could consider it. Kieran's hands paused in their work. "Then you decide what you want to do next. Stay in Wallace. Continue to California when another wagon train comes through. It's your choice." "What would you prefer I do?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or uncertainty. "My preferences shouldn't factor into your decision, Bethany." "But they do," she said softly. "You've saved my life. That creates a connection, doesn't it?" He finished wrapping her ankle and sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, I suppose it does, but your future should be your own choice, not influenced by a debt you feel you owe." "That's not what I meant." She hesitated, suddenly unsure of herself. "I meant that I've come to value your company, your perspective." The admission hung between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Kieran seemed to consider her words carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've come to value yours as well," he finally said, his voice low. "More than I expected to." Outside, thunder crashed, startlingly close. Bethany jumped, and Kieran instinctively moved closer, his hand coming to rest reassuringly on her shoulder. "Just the storm," he said, but he didn't remove his hand. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from him, of how safe she felt despite the elements raging outside. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, she leaned slightly into his touch. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her shoulder, and when she looked up, his expression had softened, the usual guardedness in his eyes replaced by something warmer. "Bethany," he began, his voice rough with emotion. But whatever he meant to say was interrupted by a tremendous crash outside, followed by a frightened whinny from Eclipse in the lean-to. Kieran was on his feet instantly. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his coat and hat. Something spooked him. Before she could protest, he was out the door, vanishing into the storm-tossed darkness. Bethany sat frozen, listening to the howling wind and driving rain, straining to hear any sound of Kieran or his horse. Minutes stretched painfully until finally the door burst open again, admitting Kieran and a gust of rain-laden wind. He was soaked to the skin, his expression grim. "Lightning struck a tree near the lean-to," he reported, shrugging out of his dripping coat. "Eclipse broke his tether and bolted. I couldn't catch him in this weather." The implications sank in. "He's gone, but how will we? I'll track him once the storm passes," Kieran assured her, though his tone betrayed his concern. "He won't go far, he's too well trained, but it means we're on foot until I find him." Bethany nodded, trying to hide her dismay. "At least we have shelter for tonight." "Yes." He glanced toward the single narrow bed, then back to her. "You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "You're soaked through again," she pointed out. "You need to be closer to the heat." "I've slept in worse conditions." "That doesn't mean you should when there's an alternative." She lifted her chin stubbornly. "The bed is big enough for both of us if we're careful, and we can put blankets between us if propriety demands it." Kieran looked surprised, then amused. "Are you always this practical, Miss Keller? When survival is concerned, yes." She smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "Though my mother would be scandalized." A chuckle escaped him, warming her more than the fire. "Mine would probably approve of your common sense." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "All right, but I'll stay on top of the blankets, you underneath. That should satisfy propriety enough." As the storm continued its assault on the small cabin, they prepared for the night. Kieran added more wood to the fire, ensuring it would burn through most of the dark hours. Bethany arranged the blankets on the narrow bed, creating a barrier of sorts between where they would lie. When Kieran finally settled beside her, careful to maintain the boundary she'd established, Bethany was acutely aware of his presence, the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle shifting of his weight on the creaking frame, the lingering scent of rain on his skin. "Try to sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." She nodded in the darkness, though sleep seemed an unlikely prospect with him so near. "Kieran, yes, thank you, not just for coming back for me, but for everything since." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have drifted off. Then, just as her own eyes grew heavy, she heard his whispered response. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be right now, Bethany. Storm and all." The words followed her into sleep, a comfort against the tempest that continued to rage outside their fragile shelter. Bethany woke to stillness and gray pre-dawn light filtering through the cabin's small window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed world. She became aware of warmth against her back and realized that, during the night, the careful barrier of blankets had been breached. Kieran's arm draped protectively around her waist, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep against her back. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, surprised not by the intimacy of their position, but by how natural it felt. Then, remembering herself, she carefully began to extricate herself from his embrace. The movement roused him. She felt his sudden tension as he, too, realized their changed circumstances. "I'm sorry," he murmured, immediately pulling away. "I didn't mean to, it's all right," she assured him quickly, sitting up and drawing the blanket around her shoulders. "We were both asleep, and it was comforting, actually." Kieran sat up as well, running a hand through his tousled hair. In the soft dawn light, with his guard down and sleep still clinging to him, he looked younger, more vulnerable than the capable guide who had rescued her. "I should check on Eclipse," he said, clearly eager to move past the moment. "See if he's returned or left a trail I can follow." He rose and stepped to the window, peering out at the clearing day. Rain stopped. Ground will be soft good for tracking. Bethany watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Do you think we'll still reach Wallace by tomorrow?" He turned back to her, his expression carefully neutral. "Depends on how quickly I can find Eclipse. On foot, carrying supplies, and with your ankle still healing, it could take twice as long." The practical problem before them helped dispel the lingering awkwardness. They set about preparing for the day. Bethany's dress was dry enough to wear, though still slightly damp at the hemline. Kieran heated water for coffee and divided the last of their provisions. "I'll hunt along the way," he said, noting her concern as he packed their meager supplies. "There's plenty of game in these forests." Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. Branches littered the ground, and a massive pine had indeed been split by lightning not 20 yards from the cabin. The air smelled fresh and clean, the morning sun beginning to burn away patches of mist that clung to the valley below them. Kieran disappeared briefly to check for signs of his horse, returning with a mixture of relief and frustration on his face. "He's been back," he reported. "Hoofprints by the lean-to from after the rain stopped, but he's moved on again. Can you track him?" "Yes, but it will slow us down." He looked troubled, glancing at her ankle. "I don't like the idea of you walking that distance, even with my support." Bethany tested her weight on the injured limb. The pain was less acute than before, though still present. "I can manage. We can't stay here indefinitely, and I won't have you delaying our journey unnecessarily on my account." A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. "You're a stubborn woman, Bethany Keller." "So I've been told," she replied, returning his smile. "Frequently." They set out as the morning mist burned away, following a trail only Kieran could discern. He fashioned a walking stick for Bethany from a sturdy branch, and she leaned on it heavily, determined not to slow their progress more than necessary. Kieran carried their supplies in a pack on his back, his rifle slung over one shoulder, alert for any sign of danger or of his wayward horse. The going was slow over the rain-softened ground. Twice they had to detour around swollen creeks, adding miles to their journey. By midday, despite her determination not to show weakness, Bethany's ankle throbbed mercilessly, and sweat dampened her brow from the exertion. "We need to rest," Kieran finally said, noting her labored breathing. "There's a clearing ahead where we can stop for a while." She didn't argue, too exhausted to maintain her facade of strength. The clearing he led them to was small but sun-dappled, a peaceful spot where wildflowers had begun to push through the spring soil. Gratefully, Bethany sank onto a fallen log while Kieran unpacked their water canteen. As she drank deeply, he knelt to examine her ankle. "It's swelling again," he said, concern evident in his voice. "We're pushing too hard." "We don't have much choice," she reminded him. "Maybe we do." He stood, scanning the forest around them. "Wait here. Rest. I'm going to see if I can pick up Eclipse's trail more clearly. If I find him, I'll come back for you, and we can make better time." Before she could protest, he had deposited the pack beside her and melted into the trees, moving with the silent grace she'd come to associate with him. Left alone, Bethany closed her eyes, listening to the forest sounds around her, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine boughs. She must have dozed, for she woke with a start to the sound of approaching footsteps. Blinking in the afternoon light, she reached instinctively for the pistol Kieran had left with her. "It's just me," came his familiar voice as he emerged from the trees. Behind him, to her immense relief, came Eclipse, looking no worse for his adventure. "You found him," she exclaimed, lowering the pistol. Kieran patted the chestnut's neck affectionately. "Caught him grazing in a meadow about a mile west of here. Fortunately, he's as glad to see me as I am to see him." With Eclipse recovered, their journey became considerably easier. Kieran helped Bethany into the saddle, and they made good progress through the afternoon, covering more ground in a few hours than they had all morning. As evening approached, they found themselves at the edge of a small valley, with mountains rising to the north and west. In the distance, Bethany could make out thin columns of smoke rising against the darkening sky. "Wallace," Kieran confirmed, following her gaze. "We'll reach it by midday tomorrow." They made camp beside a clear stream with Eclipse securely tethered nearby. Kieran disappeared briefly, returning with 2 rabbits he'd snared. He prepared them with practiced efficiency, roasting the meat over a small fire while Bethany watched, fascinated by his wilderness skills. "Where did you learn to hunt like that?" she asked as they shared the surprisingly delicious meal. "My father taught me the basics. The rest came from necessity and observation." He tossed a bone into the fire. "When you live between worlds as I do, you learn to take the best skills from each." "It must be difficult," she ventured, "not fully belonging to either world." He considered this, staring into the flames. "It is. But it also gives me freedom that others don't have. I can move between settlements and tribal lands. I understand both perspectives even when they clash." "Is that why you became a scout? To use that understanding?" he nodded. "Partly, and partly because it allowed me to keep moving, to avoid staying in one place long enough for people to decide what they thought of me." "And now," she asked softly, "do you still feel that need to keep moving?" His eyes lifted to meet hers across the fire. "Less than before," he admitted. "I've been thinking lately that there might be value in staying somewhere, in building something more permanent." The implication in his words, the way his gaze held hers, sent a flutter through Bethany's chest. "What sort of something?" "A home," he said simply. "Not just a cabin I use between journeys, but a real home, maybe a small ranch, land of my own." "That sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "What about you?" he asked. "What did you hope to find in California?" Bethany looked up at the emerging stars, considering. "A fresh start, I suppose. My father talked about an orchard. My mother dreamed of a proper house, not the small cabin we had in Missouri." She sighed. "But those were their dreams, not really mine." "And what are your dreams, Bethany Keller?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. She found herself answering with more honesty than she might have a week ago. "Safety. A home. Perhaps a small school someday. I've always loved teaching children to read, and—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "someone to share it all with. Someone who sees me for who I am, not just what society expects a woman to be." Kieran's expression softened. "Those sound like worthy dreams. And achievable ones, I hope." She met his gaze steadily. "Even here, perhaps, in Wallace." Something shifted in his eyes, a spark of hope, quickly tempered by caution. "Wallace is still a rough settlement, not as established as the towns you might find in California. But growing," she pointed out. "You said so yourself. Growing places need teachers, don't they? They do, he acknowledged, a smile playing at his lips. Though I should warn you, half the children are from mining families, rough around the edges and not accustomed to formal education. All the more reason they need someone patient to teach them, she countered, warming to the idea. And the other half, shopkeepers' children, farmers, a few professional men's families. Wallace has changed since I first came through 5 years ago. Silver was discovered in the mountains. The town's boomed since then. As they talked into the evening, the possibility of a future in Wallace became more concrete in Bethany's mind. Not the future her parents had envisioned for her, but perhaps one that suited who she had become through loss and hardship, stronger, more independent, yet still longing for connection. And as she watched Kieran across the fire, his face animated as he described the growing settlement, she realized part of that connection was already forming, tenuous but undeniable, between herself and this man who had ridden back for a woman left behind. When they finally settled for sleep, Kieran insisting on taking the first watch despite her protests that they were close enough to civilization to be safe, Bethany found her thoughts drifting to what awaited them in Wallace, and whether the bond forged between them in the wilderness could survive in the more complex world of a frontier town. Wallace, Idaho came into view shortly after noon the next day, nestled in a narrow valley between steep, forested mountains. To Bethany's surprise, it was larger than she had imagined, not merely a cluster of rough cabins, but a proper town with a main street lined with wooden buildings, some quite substantial. Church spires rose against the backdrop of mountains, and the sounds of construction echoed as they approached. "It's bigger than I expected," she remarked as Kieran led Eclipse down the slope toward the town. "The silver strikes brought people rushing in," he explained. "When I first passed through, there were maybe 50 souls here. Now there's close to 1,000 and more coming every month." As they drew closer, Bethany could see the signs of rapid growth, new buildings under construction at the edges of town. Wagons loaded with supplies trundling along the muddy streets. Miners in dirty clothes mingling with smartly dressed businessmen and their wives. Kieran helped her dismount at the edge of the main street, supporting her as she tested her weight on her injured ankle. Though still painful, 4 days of rest and Kieran's careful tending had improved it considerably. "We should get you to the doctor first," he said, his hand warm at her elbow. "Doc Wilson's office is just down the street." As they made their way slowly along the boardwalk, Bethany was aware of curious glances from passers-by. A woman with a dusty, travel-worn appearance, leaning on a tall, half-Indian man with a rifle slung over his shoulder, they made an unusual sight, even in a frontier town accustomed to newcomers. Dr. Wilson proved to be a kindly, white-haired gentleman whose small office smelled of carbolic soap and herbs. He examined Bethany's ankle with gentle efficiency, nodding with approval at Kieran's treatment. "You've done well with this, Kane," he told Kieran. "Another week of rest and she'll be good as new. Nothing broken, just a nasty sprain." "How do you two know each other?" Bethany asked, noting the easy familiarity between them. The doctor chuckled. "Kieran brings me half my patients, lost miners, injured trappers, the occasional settler who's had a run-in with nature, and he's patched up more than a few himself before bringing them to me. The doctor taught me proper bandaging techniques," Kieran explained. "After I brought in a trapper with a bear mauling that I'd wrapped rather poorly." "Poor technique, but good instincts," Wilson corrected. "The man would have bled out without your intervention." As they left the doctor's office with fresh bandages and a tonic for pain, Bethany felt a new appreciation for Kieran's skills and his standing in the community. Whatever prejudice he might face as a man of mixed heritage, His actions had clearly earned him respect from at least some of Wallace's residents. "Now for some proper food and a place for you to rest," Kieran said, leading her carefully along the bustling street. "There's a decent boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan. She might have a room available." Mrs. Callahan turned out to be a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who took one look at Bethany's bedraggled appearance and immediately bustled her inside, clucking sympathetically. "Left behind by a wagon train were you, disgraceful," she exclaimed when Kieran explained their situation. "Well, you're safe now, dear. I have a lovely room at the back of the house, nice and quiet for your recovery." As Bethany was shown to the promised room, clean, simply furnished, with a real bed that looked like heaven after days in the wilderness, she glanced back at Kieran, suddenly reluctant to part from him. "Will you?" she began, not quite sure what she wanted to ask. "I'll see to Eclipse, then return later to check on you," he promised, seeming to understand her unspoken concern. "Rest now. You're safe here." Left alone in the tidy room, Bethany sat on the edge of the bed, emotions washing over her in waves, relief at reaching civilization, gratitude for Kieran's unwavering help, and beneath it all, a growing anxiety about what would happen next between them. After the shared dangers and intimacies of their journey, would he simply return to his solitary life, leaving her to forge her own path in Wallace? The thought left an unexpected ache in her chest. A knock at the door roused her from these thoughts. Mrs. Callahan entered with a steaming tub of water, clean towels, and most wonderfully a plain but clean dress. "Thought you might appreciate a proper wash," the older woman said kindly. "And something fresh to wear. It belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to boys. Looks to be about your size." The luxury of a proper bath and clean clothes brought tears to Bethany's eyes. "Thank you. You're very kind." "Not kindness, just decency, Mrs. Callahan replied, unconsciously echoing Kieran's words from days ago. "Dinner's at 6 in the main dining room. Mr. Kane is welcome to join us if he wishes." The invitation, so casually extended, suggested Kieran was known and accepted at the boarding house. Another piece of his life in Wallace that Bethany was beginning to assemble. Freshly bathed and dressed, her hair neatly braided and her spirits lifted, Bethany made her way cautiously downstairs that evening. Her ankles still protested weight-bearing, but the doctor's tonic had dulled the worst of the pain. The dining room was cheerfully lit with oil lamps. A long table set for the boarding house's residents, currently 3 mining engineers, a young clerk from the assay office, and an elderly schoolteacher who, Mrs. Callahan had informed her, was retiring at the end of the term. Kieran was already there, standing somewhat awkwardly near the entrance. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was damp from washing, his shirt clean, his usual buckskins replaced with dark trousers. He looked more conventionally handsome than she had ever seen him, yet somehow less himself without the wilderness gear that seemed a natural extension of his character. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, and she felt a flush rise to her cheeks at his frank appreciation. "You look," he began, then seemed to remember they were not alone. "Much recovered," he finished more formally. "Clean clothes and a bath work wonders," she said with a small smile, "as does knowing one isn't lost in the wilderness anymore." Mrs. Callahan seated them side by side at the table, introducing Bethany to the other boarders. The conversation over the simple but hearty meal, roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, flowed easily, with much curiosity about Bethany's journey and her plans. "I was hoping to teach," she told the retiring schoolteacher, Mrs. Grimes, when the older woman inquired about her intentions. "I have some experience from back home in Missouri, though no formal certification." Mrs. Grimes brightened visibly. My dear, that's providential. The town council has been searching for my replacement with little success. Most qualified teachers are reluctant to relocate to a mining town so far from civilization. But Wallace seems quite civilized, Bethany observed, glancing around the comfortable dining room. The elderly teacher chuckled. Now, perhaps, but our reputation still reflects our wilder days, I'm afraid. Would you consider applying for the position? The term ends in 3 weeks, which would give us time to introduce you to the children and the curriculum. The unexpected opportunity sent Bethany's mind racing. I would be honored to be considered, she said carefully. Though I would need to find permanent lodgings, and I have very little in the way of funds or possessions. The position comes with a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, Mrs. Grimes informed her. Nothing grand, but comfortable enough for a single teacher. And there's a modest salary, paid monthly by the town council. Throughout this exchange, Bethany was acutely aware of Kieran beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. When she glanced at him, his expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a warmth that encouraged her. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Kieran offered to walk her back to her room. In the quiet hallway, away from the curious eyes of the other boarders, they paused, suddenly awkward with each other after the easy companionship of their journey. It seems you may have found your place sooner than expected, he said, breaking the silence. Bethany nodded, studying his face in the soft lamplight. If the town council approves me for the position, do you think they will? They'd be fools not to, he said with conviction. And while Wallace has its share of fools, the council members are generally sensible men. She smiled at his assessment. And what about you, Kieran? Will you be leaving soon? Back to scouting, he hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. I was thinking of staying in town a while longer. I've been offered steady work with the Silver Company, guiding their survey teams into the mountains. Hope fluttered in her chest. So you'll be based here, in Wallace, at my cabin just outside town. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Bethany, these past days with you have been life-changing, she offered softly when he struggled to find the right words. Relief flooded his features. Yes, exactly that. For me as well, she admitted. Kieran took a half step closer, his voice dropping to ensure their privacy. I know it's sudden. We've known each other less than a week, but I feel a connection to you that I can't explain and don't want to ignore. Nor do I, Bethany whispered, her heart pounding. I'm not asking for promises, he continued earnestly. Just time. Time for us to learn more about each other here in Wallace. To see if what began on the trail can grow into something more substantial. She reached out, tentatively placing her hand on his arm. I would like that very much, Kieran. The smile that transformed his face was worth all the hardship of their journey. Gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, a kiss so light and tender it might have been imagined. Yet it sent warmth cascading through her entire body. When he straightened, his eyes were dark with emotion. Until tomorrow, then. Until tomorrow, she echoed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his arm. As she watched him walk away down the hallway, Bethany felt a certainty settling in her heart. The wagon train leaving her behind had seemed a disaster, an abandonment that might have ended her life. Instead, it had led her here to Wallace, to a possible new beginning, and to Kieran Kane, a man who had ridden back when everyone else had moved on. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity for Bethany. The town council, impressed by her education and enthusiasm, unanimously approved her appointment as the new schoolteacher. Mrs. Grimes proved to be a thorough mentor, introducing Bethany to the 30-odd children who attended the one-room schoolhouse, guiding her through the curriculum and helping her prepare for the responsibilities of the position. The small cottage behind the school, as promised, was simple but cozy, a main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen. After the weeks of travel and uncertainty, having a space to call her own felt like an unimaginable luxury. Throughout these busy days, Kieran was a constant presence, though a discreet one. Mindful of her reputation in her new community, he called on her properly at the boarding house, accompanied her to Sunday services at the small church, and helped her move into the teacher's cottage once it was ready. If the townspeople had opinions about the growing relationship between the new schoolteacher and the half-Indian scout, they kept them largely to themselves, at least within Bethany's hearing. On a warm June evening, 2 days before the end of the school term and Mrs. Grimes's official retirement, Kieran arrived at Bethany's cottage with his arms full of wildflowers and a mysterious burlap sack. "I thought we might have a picnic," he suggested, presenting the flowers with uncharacteristic shyness. "There's a spot not far from town, up on the ridge where you can see for miles. The sunset from there is something special." Bethany accepted the bouquet with delight. "That sounds wonderful. Let me just find something to put these in." As she arranged the colorful blooms in her only pitcher, she was struck by how different her life had become in just 1 month. From abandoned and facing death in the wilderness to established in a new community with a home, a purpose, and a man who looked at her as though she were the sunrise after the longest night. The spot Kieran led her to did indeed offer a spectacular view. The town of Wallace spread below them in the valley, with mountain peaks rising majestically in every direction, their slopes darkened with pine forests. The evening air was warm and fragrant with wildflowers and sage. From the burlap sack, Kieran produced a surprising feast: fresh bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a bottle of wine. "Mrs. Callahan helped with the provisions," he admitted when Bethany expressed amazement at the spread. "She seems to have appointed herself our guardian angel." "She's been incredibly kind," Bethany agreed, settling on the blanket he had laid out. "As has everyone in Wallace, really. I keep expecting someone to object to my appointment, given my lack of formal qualifications, but they all seem genuinely grateful to have a teacher who's willing to stay. Wallace may be rough in some ways, but it's a community that values practical skills over paper credentials." Kieran handed her a cup of wine. "They can see you care about the children, and that matters more than certificates from some Eastern college." They ate as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange, pink, and purple. The conversation flowed easily between them, as it had since their first days on the trail. Kieran told her about his new position with the Silver Company, how it allowed him to use his skills while providing more stability than his previous nomadic life. "And the cabin I mentioned," he said, a slight tension entering his voice. "I've been working on it, expanding it. It was barely more than a shelter before, but now—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Now I think it might be suitable for more than just one person." Bethany's heart quickened at the implication. Over the past weeks, their feelings for each other had deepened and clarified, but neither had spoken openly of a future together. "Kieran," she began carefully, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" He set aside his cup and took her hands in his. "I know it's soon. Probably too soon by conventional standards, but nothing about our meeting or our circumstances has been conventional." She squeezed his hands encouragingly. "No, it hasn't. I love you, Bethany Keller," he said simply, the words hanging in the golden evening air. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment I found you under that cottonwood tree, injured but unbowed. Your courage, your intelligence, Your kindness, they've captured me completely." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes as emotion swelled in her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "When you came back for me when everyone else left me behind, it was like finding something I didn't know I was looking for." Kieran reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the fading sunlight. A ring, simple but beautiful, a band of silver with a small pearl set into it. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "One of the few things I have left of her. She would have loved you, I think." He held it between them, his expression earnest. "Bethany Keller, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in Wallace?" Without hesitation, she nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, Kieran, yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had always been meant for her hand. Then he drew her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more certain than the tentative one they had shared at the boarding house weeks ago. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, they remained on the ridge, talking of their plans, their hopes, their future together. A future neither could have imagined a month ago, born from what had seemed a disaster, but had proved to be the greatest fortune of their lives. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Wallace, met with general approval and even some satisfaction, as though the town had collectively decided they were well matched and had been waiting for them to realize it themselves. Mrs. Callahan insisted on hosting the wedding at her boarding house, declaring her garden the perfect setting for a June ceremony. "Nothing elaborate," she assured Bethany when the younger woman expressed concern about imposing, "but proper. You both deserve a proper celebration." The wedding took place on the last Saturday in June, with most of the town in attendance. Bethany wore a dress of pale blue silk that the wives of the town councilmen had collectively gifted her, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Kieran, standing tall and proud beside the town's young minister, wore a new suit that transformed him from frontier scout to respectable citizen, though the wildness of his spirit still showed in his eyes. They spoke their vows beneath an arch of roses, promising to love and support each other through all the challenges frontier life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople seemed to echo from the surrounding mountains. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than Bethany had seen since leaving Missouri. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit throughout the garden, Kieran drew her away from the festivities to a quiet corner. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. She leaned against him, contentment filling her. "More than I ever thought possible. Are you?" "Beyond words," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I'm ready to take my wife home whenever she's willing to make our excuses." The cabin Kieran had prepared for them stood on a small rise overlooking a meadow, about a mile outside town, close enough for Bethany's daily journey to the schoolhouse, but far enough to provide the privacy and connection to nature that Kieran cherished. He had indeed expanded it considerably, adding a proper bedroom, a small study where Bethany could prepare her lessons, and a covered porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. That night, as they began their life together, Bethany reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this moment. If the wagon train hadn't left her behind, if Kieran hadn't been tracking it and noticed her absence, if he hadn't made the decision to ride back for a stranger, none of this would exist. Their paths would never have crossed, their love never discovered. "What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, noticing her contemplative mood as they stood on the porch of their new home, gazing at the star-filled sky. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she answered, turning in his embrace to face him. "If I hadn't lost my family, if I hadn't been injured and left behind, I never would have found you, never would have come to Wallace, never would have discovered this life that already feels more right than the one I was heading toward." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The path that seems darkest sometimes leads to the greatest light. Your mother's wisdom," she guessed. "Yes," he smiled, tracing her cheek with gentle fingers. "She would have called our meeting Wagon sacred, mysterious, a gift from forces beyond our understanding." "I like that thought," Bethany said softly, "that even in our darkest moments something sacred might be unfolding. I know it to be true," he whispered against her lips, "because it brought me you." Over the next year, Kieran and Bethany settled into a rhythm of life that blended their diverse skills and backgrounds. The school thrived under Bethany's enthusiastic guidance, growing to nearly 50 students as more families arrived in the booming mining town. Her reputation as a caring but firm teacher spread, and parents noted with approval how even the most reluctant children seemed to blossom under her instruction. Kieran's work with the Silver Company provided stability while allowing him to use his tracking and wilderness skills. He became known as the most reliable guide in the region, respected for his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to navigate safely through the most challenging conditions. The prejudice he had feared facing as a man of mixed heritage did occasionally surface, particularly from newcomers to Wallace, but the community that had embraced him and Bethany generally closed ranks around them when needed. Their cabin expanded along with their aspirations. Kieran added another room in anticipation of the family they hoped to have, as well as a small stable where Eclipse was joined by a gentle mare Bethany had learned to ride. They planted a garden that incorporated both European vegetables and native plants Kieran's mother had taught him were edible or medicinal. In the spring of 1855, their family grew with the arrival of their son, whom they named Joseph after Bethany's father. The birth was difficult, long hours of labor that left Bethany exhausted and Kieran frantic with worry. But when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, the pain seemed to dissolve in the wave of love that washed over both new parents. "He has your eyes," Bethany whispered, tracing a finger over their son's tiny features. "And your spirit, I think," Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Look how fiercely he announces his arrival." As Joseph grew from infant to toddler, the wisdom of Kieran's assessment became apparent. Their son was indeed spirited curious about everything, determined to explore his world with a fearlessness that kept both parents vigilant. He inherited Kieran's natural affinity for the outdoors and Bethany's love of stories, often demanding one more tale before bedtime with a persistence that neither parent could resist. By 1857, Wallace had grown into a proper town with several streets of permanent buildings, including a new schoolhouse where Bethany continued to teach, bringing Joseph with her each day. The mining industry had stabilized, bringing more families and fewer of the rough, single men who had characterized its early days. The Kanes were now established members of the community, their unusual beginning all but forgotten in the normalcy of their present life. It was in the autumn of that year, as golden aspen leaves drifted down around their expanded cabin, that Bethany shared news of another addition to their family. "You're certain?" Kieran asked, joy lighting his features as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "As certain as I can be," she confirmed, covering his hand with her own. "Dr. Wilson agrees. The baby should arrive in late spring." Their daughter, Catherine, named for Kieran's mother, was born on a perfect May morning in 1858, with sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and meadowlarks singing in the nearby fields. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry, Catherine's birth was swift and relatively easy, as though she was eager to join her family with minimum fuss. "She has your calm," Kieran observed as he watched Bethany nursing their newborn daughter. "Thank goodness. One Joseph is all the excitement this household can handle," Bethany laughed, gazing down at their daughter's peaceful face. "Don't be fooled. I suspect she'll show her own kind of determination when the time comes." Life settled into a pattern of joy and occasional challenges. The children grew, the community prospered, and the Kane family became known for their hospitality, their garden, and the blend of traditions they maintained celebrating both Christmas and the Shoshone solstice rituals Kieran remembered from his childhood, teaching their children both the Bible and the stories of his mother's people. In the winter of 1863, a decade after Kieran had found Bethany beside that lonely trail, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching Joseph and Catherine playing in the fresh snow. At 32, Bethany's face showed the subtle lines of motherhood and years of frontier living, but her eyes remained bright with the same intelligence and determination that had first drawn Kieran to her. At 35, Kieran's frame was still powerful, though a few silver strands now appeared in his dark hair, testament to years of outdoor work in all conditions. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" Bethany asked, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. "If the wagon train hadn't left me behind," Kieran wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer against the chill. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our life, our children, our home, the community we're part of, and I can't imagine any other path." "Nor can I," she agreed, watching as Joseph helped his younger sister form a snowball. "But it's strange to think how close we came to never knowing each other. To never having all of this. That's why each day is precious," he said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Because we know better than most how easily it might never have been." From the yard came shrieks of laughter as Catherine managed to land a snowball on her brother's chest, prompting a retaliatory barrage that sent her running for the shelter of the porch and her parents' protection. "Papa, help!" she giggled, hiding behind Kieran's legs as Joseph approached with another snowball. "Now, son," Kieran said with mock seriousness, "is that any way to treat your sister? She started it." Joseph protested, though his eyes sparkled with mischief. Bethany laughed, the sound carrying across the snow-covered meadow. "Then I suppose we'll have to finish it," she declared, scooping up a handful of snow from the porch rail and forming it into a perfect sphere. Soon all four Kanes were engaged in a spirited snowball fight, their laughter echoing in the crisp winter air. As Bethany ducked behind a pine tree to avoid her husband's well-aimed throw, she caught his eye across the yard. In that moment of connection, she saw reflected in his gaze all that they had built together from the most unlikely of beginnings, a family, a home, a love that had transformed both their lives. And in the depths of her heart, she offered silent gratitude for a broken wheel that had slowed a wagon train, for an injured ankle that had left her behind, and for a man who had ridden back 3 days to find a woman he didn't know, but couldn't leave to face the wilderness alone. What had seemed a disaster had become their greatest blessing. What had begun as an act of basic humanity had blossomed into a love that would sustain them through all the seasons of their lives together in the shadow of the Idaho mountains, where their story, unlikely, beautiful, and entirely their own, would continue to unfold with each passing year.